All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the last module for CRM 250. This week we're going to be discussing issues that are emerging and the future of policing. As you know, being able to predict the future is extremely difficult, right? In any aspect, right? It's really hard to ever really predict like what's going to happen a year or 5 years or whatever down the road. But especially when you're discussing policing, like it's so difficult to predict, what's going to happen. Policing, in and of itself, as we've discussed, is not really very prone to change. Now they have changed, right, and sometimes slowly and sometimes fast. But when it really does happen, it's almost always slow. But sometimes you have events that happen that cause the police to react and create change more quickly than normal. And these changes are the result of outside influences that the police have to react to. And who and what these influences are. Right? Sometimes it's specific to a particular police agency, and other times it's an event of such magnitude that it creates this outsized influence on police, at a national level. So even though, one specific type of event may create change, there's several types of changes that are continually occurring, that police have to contend with. And the first of that is demographic change. Demographics are what's the makeup of society look like? Age, race, ethnicity, like what does society itself, look like? So the United States, right now the population is growing like it is, pretty much everywhere around the world, but it's also aging. People in the United States are living longer and people are having fewer children. So you have this older population that you're dealing with in the United States, and it's just going to keep getting bigger as we go forward. So an older population requires certain things from the police, and that's different than what is required if you have a younger population. You have older people are more vulnerable to victimization, and it could be physical victimization, but it could also be victimization due to scams or cyber victimization. Younger people, specifically if you're talking about like 18 to 24-year-olds, kind of as a rule, those people commit more crimes than people of other ages, and especially if you're talking about property crime. That's why college towns oftentimes have pretty high crime rates, because you have this whole, you draw in all these people that are 18 to 24, and it increases your crime rate because 18 to 24-year-olds are more prone to committing crime. So if your population is younger, then police expect more crime and different kinds of crimes. And these demographic shifts also influence things like police recruiting. So police have to really be aware of what's happening in the communities where they work. Also, the U.S. is continuing to become more diverse ethnically and racially. When you have when you have slow changes in diversity, they don't usually have a real dramatic impact on policing, right? Because it's change over time and it's a slow change, and police can adapt to that. But when you have these quick and dynamic changes, that could certainly impact policing. So in the book, it discusses the increase in the Vietnamese population in Minnesota and the challenges that created for policing. But if you want to talk about closer to home, in St. Louis in the 90s and early 2000s, the Bosnian population of St. Louis increased tremendously, and because they're fleeing the genocide that was happening over there in their home country. So you had these Bosnian refugees that were all coming to St. Louis. So not only did you have these language barriers, but you also had these refugees were coming from a place where they could not trust the police, right? And the police had actually been involved in the killing of people. So just think about the challenges that the police in St. Louis faced, during that time. Like how do you interact with a population that comes from some place like that, where you also have these language barriers and you have religious, like you have all these different things, and they came really, really quickly. And things like religious diversity, gender identity, sexual orientation, like all those things can create unique challenges for police, especially if you have quick change. Okay, so kind of along the same vein, we're going to kind of run this this kind of out for a while. Immigration and migration also impacts the police. And those things can impact what? Your demographics, right? So if you're talking about immigration itself, the federal government is tasked really with that responsibility. But local police are then faced, with the challenges presented by an influx of immigrants. So the federal government's in charge of enforcing immigration laws, but local police are the ones, if people immigrate, they're the ones that have to interact with those people. So that is, some of those challenges are ones we literally just talked about. But another challenge is migration within the United States. So you have people moving from one part of the country to another, and they don't necessarily leave those beliefs behind, right? They bring them with them. So they may have different expectations for the police. They may have different experiences with the police. Depending on what the ages are, it may change your age distribution where you're at. So people moving from different parts of the country, migrating, can also cause demographic changes, like what we've already discussed. Okay, economic conditions are also an important thing that impacts the police. Economic conditions impact crime, disorder, demand for police services, and economic changes are sometimes hard to predict. Nobody really expected the housing bubble in 2008 to happen. Sometimes recessions happen when you're not expecting them. So you can't always necessarily predict, what's going to happen economically. But things like the unemployment rate, poverty rate, like those things impact crime, disorder, and how much police services you need. But economic conditions also impact policing let me back up a little bit. Okay, so economic conditions can impact migration. Okay, so where people are moving throughout the United States for different job opportunities, right? And that's happened multiple times throughout the history of the United States. People moved from farms into cities to work in the factories. This has happened multiple times throughout history. But migration is important for police agencies because of their dependence on a tax base for their funding. So if you have residents leaving an area, migrating to somewhere else, that's going to decrease your population. That decreases your tax base, which therefore decreases how much money police departments have. Now that can affect their ability to hire new officers, replace equipment, that impacts their ability to operate. So if you have people moving out, you have less taxes. You have people moving in, you have more taxes. All right, so migration can directly impact the economic well-being of police agencies. Economic conditions are also important for police. If you're thinking about the police agency's ability to hire. Okay, when unemployment is high, which is generally kind of poorer economic conditions, police have many more applicants that they could choose from for policing jobs. However, because economic conditions are not good, they may not have the money available to hire the officers. So then conversely, you have economic conditions that are good and the police are able to hire, but guess what? Fewer people are looking for work, which results in fewer applicants, which results in a tougher time possibly for the police being able to hire people. Okay, trends in crime. Like everybody knows, trends in crime impact the police, right? So moving to the future, that's going to continue to be, a thing that impacts the police. It's always been a challenge for the police because criminals are always trying to find new ways, to commit crimes, and the police are always trying to catch up to that. But of course, some crimes don't really change. People steal stuff. People have been stealing stuff for thousands of years. But what they steal or how they're stealing may change. Okay? Like people steal now online, right? Or people are stealing cell phones. Like 50 years ago, nobody was doing any of those things, right? But now that's what they're doing. The crime rates are important to police, especially if you're talking about violent crime. If violent crime goes up, public expects the police to do something about it. Similarly, if you have years where the crime rate's been going down and all of a sudden it starts to rise, there's going to be this outside pressure put on the police by the public, by politicians, right? Get your crime rate under control. And sometimes there's things the police can do, but other times there's other factors influencing crime rate that the police cannot control. But crime rate has always been an issue for the police. Crime rate's always going to continue to be an issue for the police going into the future. Kind of going back to this, well, what are people stealing? Like cybercrime is going to be a really important area of crime moving into the future. As technology becomes more and more a part of our lives, criminals are going to continue to find ways to commit crimes in cyberspace. Now, what that's going to look like, who knows? There's no way to know what kind of things are going to be happening, with technology and in cyberspace in 5 or 10 years, right? That stuff moves so fast that's really, really difficult to predict what it's going to look like. But the best you can do is say, cybercrime is going to continue to be a big deal. Big events like mass shootings, like those things influence the police, even though they're a relatively rare event. And I know it seems like they're happening all the time, but really, in the scope of life, these high impact events like mass shootings, like that's a relatively rare thing. So not only do those things impact police training, and operations, but then you have officer support issues that you may need to have. So any of those kind of real big traumatic kind of events, and those are the kind of things that impact, change in policing too. If there's something that happened that shouldn't have happened or something that went wrong, right, that will impact change. And even outside agencies that, weren't involved with it at all may look at that and be like, oh man, we better check and make sure, are we up to date on those things, or what are we doing with our training, things like that. The book talks about drugs. Okay, drugs have always been part of what the police do, right? Police will continue to have to deal with drugs. Now, how they do that is changing, right? Marijuana is now legal in a lot of places, so how the police interact with that is going to be different. You're going to have more kind of driving while intoxicated with marijuana. So how drugs are going to continue to be an issue the police deal with, but maybe how and what and which drugs will continue to change. Dealing with people with like mental health issues, right? That's continue to be an issue for the police, right? And why? Well, the problem for the police has always been that they're the ones that are available 24/7. And because they're available 24/7, they're expected to be able to deal with whatever happens, right? Any possible situation that presents itself, whether they're actually equipped to handle it or not, right? There's something happening and somebody's got to do something about it. Well, that somebody is almost always the police. So they end up dealing with things like mental health issues that they're really not qualified or equipped or trained really to handle. Now, some of that's changing. There's been movement on that issue. They're starting to create things called crisis intervention teams, where the police are better trained, that they're collaborating with local health providers. Sometimes these teams include mental health professionals that respond with officers. So these are going to continue to be issues, but the police are adapting. They're trying to, figure out better ways to deal with these things. All right, so we've already hit on technology, but technology just in general is going to be an issue for the police. Not just the new kinds of crimes, but the police are going to use technology in new ways into the future, and how that is extremely difficult to predict. So just to give you a little bit of perspective, so technology's always been influential on the police, like going all the way back two-way radios, telephones in the houses, cars, right? Always been influencing the police. So I started my law enforcement career in 1999. And in 1999, we were told, you don't need a computer for anything. So we didn't have computers. And then, I don't know, maybe a year or so in, they got all of us computers. They're like, well, actually, you guys probably need email, and a few things. And then kind of later on in my career, when like Craigslist and stuff like that was happening, we were like, oh man, we need to be able to get on Craigslist, and look at what people are selling and kind of see what people are doing. And they're like, no, that's not anything. It's not gonna be a big deal. Well, of course it is, right? So it's interesting. Technology moves forward, and now there's like special investigative units that only do looking online for stuff where, back in the day they were like, no, it's not nobody's going to be doing anything with that. Okay, so how the police use technology is going to continue to change into the future. So you're always going to have technological advances, right? The police are going to try to use new technology to solve crimes, whether detecting crimes or solving crimes. Like there's always going to be some kind of new technology that they can use. But one of the issues that you run into, or the police run into, when you have these rapid advances in technology, is that oftentimes policy and law don't always keep up with the changes. So the police end up in these kind of gray areas where they don't really have policy that applies. There's really not laws that apply to it. So they're kind of operating in kind of this gray area where, we think we're fine, but maybe we're not. And really one of the biggest places where that happens is in, surveillance and privacy. There's numerous technologies, and I talk about them in the book. Like there's numerous things that the police can use, like in surveillance, but what are the privacy implications of those, right? Are those legal? Are those unlawful searches? Like there's all these things that are going to have to get worked out when you have these new technological advances. And there's also going to be advances in officer safety and accountability. So two-way radios and bulletproof vests were two of the biggest, technological advancements for police safety. Now things like gold positioning systems, body-worn cameras, right? Those things are at the forefront. When I left law enforcement in 2008, like no one was even thinking about the fact that officers would one day, wear cameras on their person. There had been dash cams for the cars, and they were becoming more prevalent at the time. But like the thought of actually wearing a camera, like that wasn't even a conversation. Like no one was even talking about that. I don't know anybody that was really anticipating that was coming. But look where we're at now, right? Body-worn cameras. If police don't have body-worn cameras, the public wants to know why, right? And not that long ago, it wasn't even something anybody was thinking about. Social media is going to be more prevalent, in police circles. That really has impacted the police because no longer do they have to necessarily rely on the media to help them do stuff. They can just put stuff straight out there to the information to the public by themselves. They use social media in criminal investigations. Think about how many times have you heard, in a news story about some suspect about their social media use, and what they're posted online and what they found, when they go in and look. Okay, so social media in investigations is going to continue to be important. They also use social media during the hiring process. So those of you thinking about jobs, or in the future at least, departments will look at that. They'll look at what you put on your social media profiles. What kind of stuff are you posting, right? So they use those kind of things also in the hiring process. Okay, so that's all kind of 5-ish year kind of stuff. But like longer term, there's going to be issues longer term. And professionalization is still an issue, for the police. Issues of privatization, federalization, militarization, terrorism, homeland security, and some of these all kind of intermingle, right, and kind of related to each other. But this debate about professionalization, we've talked about it in this class. Like it's been going on for 100 years, and it's going to continue to go into the future. Because you have the kind of this disconnect sometimes between street officers and administration. Administration's all about we want to professionalize and all that stuff. And street officers are like, what are you talking about? They don't really think about that until it's something administration tells them that they need to do or want them to do, and then you can have these conflicts. And this isn't going to change, or probably not going to change. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's already been going on 100 years. And this image of this professionalization of police, sometimes that's more about just status, really, rather than what the police are actually doing. So professionalization is not going to go away, but it's been around forever, and it's going to continue to be around for a while. Privatization of policing, that's more and more prevalent all the time. There's more and more companies, more and more places that are hiring private security guards. So I know a lot of you think about private security, you think about something akin to like a mall security guard, which are actually, they're certainly part of, private security. But there's this wide range of private security forces, what they're their ability to police. There's lots of variation. Some are your unarmed security guards, and others are almost paramilitary units, and it all depends on what they're hired to do. If you're talking about numbers, like there's way more private security officers in America than there are government-sanctioned police officers. So the ability of what these private security agencies can do, what these officers can do, is really important, for the police and the public going forward. Now they are constrained by law. Economics will constrain some of these because you're real highly trained. Like those people are really, really expensive. So there are constraints on it, but this privatization movement of police, where people are hiring their own security instead of relying on the police to come and help them, is going to impact policing and society going forward. Federalization. Okay, so federalization is really just how much crime does the federal government deal with. So it really has been developing over the last 50-ish years. Congress continues to pass more and more federal criminal laws. So that provides this wider jurisdiction for these federal law enforcement officers. So think about it. Most federal agencies have some form of law enforcement within their agencies. We all think about the alphabet agencies, FBI, DEA, ATF, right? But there are many, many more law enforcement officers in the federal system. But and really the biggest concern when you're federalizing crime control is that it undercuts state and local police agencies who are actually best equipped, to deal with most of the crime. And then the more resources you're putting to federal law enforcement, that means less resources for state and local officers. Militarization. Okay, this has really become more of an issue since 9/11. So after 9/11. So militarization is this movement where local and state police start to more resemble the military. The military and policing in the United States has always been separate, and that's a foundational kind of thing, right? The citizens of the U.S. wanted the military to do the military stuff, and they wanted policing to be different. After 9/11. And really stuff like Hurricane Katrina, those kind of things, large amounts of this surplus military equipment was given to police agencies. So police have armored, vehicles and stuff like that. And do they need it? Yeah, there's situations where that equipment really does benefit the police. But now you have this debate about are these police that are thinking about being responsive to the community, or is this more of a paramilitary, kind of operation that we have that our police are turning into? So you've got this debate about what the police should be doing, right? And that's the debate we've talked about almost all semester, right? What do the police do? What should they be doing? How should they be acting, right? So this militarization is part of all of that. So there's a push now, to really evaluate how much of that stuff should they have? What should they be doing? Okay, and how much should the federal government continue to hand out this surplus military equipment for very, very cheap to police agencies? And then kind of along that same line, Homeland Security and terrorism. So the attacks on 9/11 changed policing. Prior to that, policing really wasn't thinking about terrorism, not anywhere near the way that they do now. But now it's just part of what they do, and you have information sharing. You have these fusion centers. You've got all these different aspects that local police are involved in terrorism investigations, and that's because the local police are the ones that are best equipped to identify potential terrorist activity. So, but what that did was, to the 80s and 90s, there was this push toward community policing. And then 9/11 happened, and policing shifted again to much more legalistic. Wasn't nearly as much community policing. And now they're trying to shift it back again. But there's some that want to keep it the way it is. So there's debate about, can community policing and Homeland Security and terrorism policing, coexist? Like, can they work together? Can community policing be effective in homeland security and terrorism? So that's going to continue to be a debate. Terrorism, again, is a very, very rare event, but it gets outsized importance, right? If a terrorist attack happens, like, that's a huge deal, just kind of like these mass shootings. So it's an issue that has to be dealt with, but to what degree? How much should the local police be doing? It's going to be a debate that continues to evolve over time, especially even if you think about how does the threat scenario change, right? Is it an international terrorist threat? Is it more of a domestic terrorist threat? Like, who should the police really be thinking about, and how does that evolve over time, and how does that change what the police do over time? So, but at the core of this, you have this need for security balancing with freedom, and that's really the core thing about policing, just in general, right? But especially about this homeland security policing. How do you balance security with freedom? How much freedom are people willing to give up for security, right? And how much does the Constitution allow, on both ends of that? So you're always going to have this debate. And when you get into homeland security terrorism, boy, there's sometimes that this line really gets kind of faded and cloudy. And at that point, people always take a step back and they think, well, not always, but sometimes we'll take a step back and be like, okay, we really need to work this out and think about, like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? What role the local police or the state police or whoever should have in this. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop. Make sure you do everything you need to do for this week. And I want to say I've enjoyed the class. I hope you all have learned something. And good luck to you in your future endeavors.